Hello. Hello, this is Chiak. Okay. So let's quickly start right away because I have 59 pages to get through. So, Dead Space Callus, Part 4, the last part, Chapter 32. He would listen to the voice, he would follow what it said. After all, it had not led him astray so far. No, quite the opposite. It had broken the bonds of his imprisonment. It had plucked him from hell and brought him here. Are you comfortable? The lead scientist asked him. What was his name again? Barden? No, Bryden. He nodded. Can I get you something? He waited for the voice of the dead to tell him what was needed, but it didn't say anything. Bryden was staring at him. Istvan was not exactly sure how much time had passed. He shook his head. Not now, he said. Maybe later, asked Bryden, strangely eager. Istvan nodded. The movement felt odd. When the voice was more distant from him, everything felt false, slightly off. He felt too much like he had felt growing up, like the world was in charge of him rather than he being in charge of the world. He didn't like that. Bryden was sitting across the table staring at him, much like the small gray man had done. What did Bryden want exactly? What is it like? Bryden asked. What? Said Istvan, surprised. It chose me too, he said. It reached out and touched me, and I knew I would become its prophet. Did it do that to you too? Not knowing what Bryden was talking about, Istvan hesitated, then nodded. Bryden broke into a smile. What does it want from us? He asked. Want? Asked Istvan. It's here to save us, isn't it? Said Bryden. It wants only our own good. It wants to bring us to convergence. Has it told you what convergence will consist of? Has it told you when it will come? Confused, Istvan just stared. Bryden watched him, expression open and waiting. When Istvan didn't respond, a flicker of irritation passed over his face. You can tell me, he said. I'm one of the chosen. Chosen for what? Asked Istvan. Is this a test? Asked Bryden. Are you toying with me? Who was this man and what did he want? Istvan listened for the voice to tell him what to do. It was speaking. It was always speaking, but it wasn't talking about the man in front of him, wasn't telling him what to do. He tried to stare his way through this world and see the other, see the face of one of his dead, and feel the voice in his mouth. But the veil wasn't ready to fall. He could not make it come. It chose me too, said Bryden defensively. If it hadn't chosen me, you would still be in there. That was true, in a matter of speaking, thought Istvan. But even when Bryden had been staring right at him, he hadn't seen him. It had taken the other scientists, the woman, to recognize him. But to try to calm the fellow, he nodded. It did calm him. Bryden smiled and leaned back in his chair a little. Now the question is, what does it want us to do? But Istvan had a hard time paying attention. Inside his head, the voice had started to speak again. See me, it said. Understand me. Share me. See me, he muttered. See you, Bryden said, surprised. But I do see you. I'm right here, sitting across the table from you. No, Istvan said Istvan. See him. I want to see him. Him? Who is him? Asked Bryden. When Istvan just stared, he said, Do you mean it? Do you mean the marker? Did he? What was a marker? He didn't know for certain, and the moment in which the voice seemed like it was giving him specific direction had faded into a quieter recital. Not things he could hear exactly or know why they were important, but he could still feel his brain taking them in. "All right," Bryden said. "Yes, why not? You'll see it. That makes sense. We'll have to ignore a few security protocols, but I am, after all, the director of this project. This is much more important than a few security protocols." The vid near the wall chirped. Bryden glanced at it briefly. When he turned back, there was yet another look of irritation on his face. "You'll have to excuse me a moment," he said. "This won't take long." He stood and approached the monitor. When he accepted the link, Istvan could see a woman's face, the face of the female scientist who had seen him and recognized him. "What is it, Dr. Dexter?" asked Bryden. "I'm busy." "The prisoner is not in his quarters," said the woman. "Do you happen to know where he is?" "First of all," Istvan heard Bryden say, "he is not a prisoner. He's our guest. Second, yes, I do know where he is. He's here with me." "What's he doing there with you?" asked Dexter. Asked Dexter. Why didn't you follow protocol?" "I needed to talk to him," said Bryden, "and I didn't think that protocol applied in this case." "No? Why not?" "I don't have to explain myself to you, Dr. Dexter," said Bryden. "No, actually, you do," said Dexter. "And be careful what you say. You can be sure that it will all appear in my report." He started to retort, then apparently reconsidered. Istvan watched him take a deep breath. "You still don't understand, do you?" he said. "Understand what?" "The work we're doing here, the nature of it, how important it is. There is no turning back now, Dr. Dexter." "Bryden," she said, bridling, "you can't just—" But that was all she had a chance to say because Bryden had cut the feed. He came back to the table, his smile restored. "Now, where were we?" he asked. "Oh, yes. You wanted to see it. Follow me." It was late, the workday mostly done. The few scientists still seated and working within the control room turned and looked at them when they entered. Most of them turned quickly back to what they were doing, but one or two kept staring for a time. Bryden ignored them. He simply walked across the room and over to the observation window on the other side, drawing Istvan by the hand after him. "There it is," he said, and pointed. Through the window, Istvan could see it, a strange, twisting obelisk, blackish red and with a reddish glow, inscribed all over with strange figures. Or not so strange, really, for as he looked at them, he began to see in them the warp and weft of the other world, the material which the veil was made of when it fell. Even the very lineaments, I actually do not know what this word is, even the very lineaments and workings of the faces that came to him in that world. If he was allowed to look at it long enough, he felt he would even begin to see how these signs and symbols formed the hiss and the mutter of the voices that came to him. Yes, here was a thing that brought everything together, that made everything make sense. Here was the key to everything in existence. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" said Bryden. Istvan nodded. It was hard to take his eyes off of it, but he slowly dragged them around to look at Bryden. "I want to go in there," he said. "There'll be time enough for that," said Bryden. "Can't do everything all at once." "No," said Istvan. "Now." They stared at one another for a long moment, Bryden with a certain curiosity, Istvan steadily, his gaze hard. Finally, Bryden sighed and turned away. "All right," he said, if that's what needs to happen." He slid his key card through and entered the code. As the door slid open, more of the scientists turned to watch them. Then Bryden ushered him in. "Not strictly protocol," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. The door closed behind them. The room itself was not the same as in the rest of the complex, Isvin saw. It had the floor made of solid stone, and the bottom part of this chamber had been cut out of the rock with man-made walls built up on top of it. The marker rose in the middle of it, at once brutal and majestic. He could almost feel the energy emanating from it. Just looking at it made him dizzy. There, said Bryden. Now you stood in the same room with it, let's go. But Istvin ignored him. He began to move slowly toward the marker. Istvin, said Bryden, and then louder, Istvin. He felt the man's hand on his shoulder and shook it off. He kept going. Bryden said something, but Istvin could hardly hear it over the sound of the voice, guiding him forward, leading him toward this thing of great beauty. It was in his head, too. He now felt, or something like it anyway. It was in his head, too, he now felt, or something like it anyway. All the necessary details and plans were stored up there now. That was what it had been doing as it prodded his brain. It had been making itself a space within him. But there was Bryden grabbing his arm again and spinning him around. This irritated him, made him bare his teeth at him, but Bryden hung on. Not now, he was saying. We have to clear it first for the sake of... And then the door behind them opened and Dr. Dexter came in. She looked angry, her face flushed and red. Bryden, she shouted. Even you have to know that this goes far beyond the boundaries of... But Istvin had stopped listening by then. Bryden was listening, though. Distracted enough so that Istvin could wrench himself free. He stumbled onward toward the marker. He cast a brief glance behind him, saw the two scientists shouting at one another. Bryden's gaze darting back and forth between Dr. Dexter and him. And then he was at the base of the marker itself. He reached out and pressed the flat of his palm against it and felt the veil of that other world falling over his gaze again, a tremendous power behind it. In the distance, someone was shouting. Slowly, carefully, he opened his mind up, unfolding it gently, and then he closed his eyes and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened, and then he felt something flowing through him, sorting through his mind in a million ways at once. The other world rushed up and blotted everything else out as if it had never existed, and who knows, maybe it never had. He looked up, and there, where the marker had been, was now the face and body of murdered Khan, 6 or 7 times as large as he had been in life. Khan was staring at Istvin, looking down at him. He bent farther down, brought his face closer until his head obscured much of Istvin's gaze, and Istvin was standing in his shadow. And then, blood still dripping from his neck, he smiled. Suddenly, there was a rush of energy that made Istvin's body vibrate to the very core. All around him, he heard the sound of screams. His mind cleared itself in a burst of white light. He neither knew who he was nor where he was, nor even if he existed. And then he collapsed. "33. It came in a burst big enough that even Grotter felt it. It made him shudder. He steadied himself on the rail, waited for the feeling of vertigo to pass. Arthur clutched his head and gave a little cry, and then began beating his head against the desk. Others on the bridge were struggling as well, looking dazed or confused, or even crazed, and Grotter told himself once again that if it was this bad up here, thank God they weren't on the planet itself. When it finally died away, the first order of business was to get Arthur to stop beating his head against the console. The man's forehead was bruised and the skin was beginning to split. In just a few minutes, he had done himself serious damage. But it also gave Grotter an excuse to have other crew members bundle him off and put him in the brig, thus killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Now Blackwell would have no eyes and ears, would not know what he and the Gray Man were planning. Only then did Grotter turn to Ensign Haley. She was scribbling madly away, as if possessed, and mumbling under her breath as she did so. She kept spinning him image after image, all of it obviously connected to the marker, followed by several pages of equations and instructions. He immediately spun them along to the gray man. By the time she was done, 5 or 6 hours later, she was exhausted and shaking, ready to fall apart. He held her back to her quarters and helped her lie down. But, she was saying, uh, uh, it's calling to me. Shh, he interrupted. There'll be other times. 30 minutes later, he had the rest of the crew back on the bridge, including a replacement for Arthur. He made sure that everything was okay, then left. He visited Arthur in the brig and found him suspicious and resentful and paranoid. He had torn most of the bandages off his head and kept asking clumsily veiled questions meant to try to determine what had happened in his absence. There was vacuuming happening outside. Groder stonewalled him, then left. He'd only been back in his own quarters a few minutes when the gray man contacted him by vid. These are very good, he said. Very helpful. They teach us a lot. What do they teach you exactly? Asked Groder. The gray man smiled. Too early to say, he said, but we need more. What are the conditions that led to this? I'm not certain yet, said Groder. A headache, I believe. What caused the headache? I don't know, said Groder. What normally causes a headache? Check the marker readings, said the gray man. But don't stop there. Find out what's going on down on the planet and how it correlates with what's happening with her drawings. If other data is an indication, there'll be a connection. Other data? The gray man smiled. Need to know basis, he said. Find out what you can. Get her to do more. If it gets too dangerous, get out. Above all, keep both her and whatever's happening down on the planet a secret. Nuke the planet if you have to. If we get enough out of her, we'll be fine without it. So I'm going to say that right now, I might actually need to end up cutting this a lot shorter than I intended because I can feel my voice is not doing very well today. 34. They're not responding to our hail, sir, said the communications officer. No, said the captain. We'll keep trying. While we're at it, we might as well move into orbit. He turned to the navigator. See to it. From near the back of the bridge, Jency watched. He wasn't supposed to be there exactly, but when he'd arrived, nobody seemed to give him a second glance. He was curious to see the planets from the air. Curious, too, to get a sense of who or what might be down there. Who would answer the hail? Apparently no one. You have the right frequency? Asked the captain. It's the same frequency we used before. Same coding? Same coding. Try other frequencies, the captain said. Other codings as well. Maybe they had to change it and neglected to tell us. See if anything comes up. But nothing did. At least not at first. They were just turning into orbit when the communications officer started picking up something on one of the distress channels. Play it loud so we can all hear, said the captain. The captain, play it. Excuse me. Play it, repeated the captain. He put it on. This is a warning, it said. This sector has become quarantined. All landing on Aspera is forbidden. Anyone and everyone must turn back, no exceptions. After a moment of silence, it repeated, on loop. Does that apply to us? Asked the navigation officer. Or is that just something they set up to scare the unauthorized away? Considering that we can't get anyone to respond to our hail, said the captain, I think it does apply to us. Something must have gone wrong. They kept trying to raise someone, without success. The captain stood placidly, apparently unconcerned. Should we turn around and leave? Jency wants to ask, But he wasn't supposed to be there on the bridge, and his brother was, after all, down on the planet. He wanted to know what had happened to him. "What do we do, Captain?" asked the navigator. "Continue to establish orbit," said the captain. "We have to figure out what to do about the supplies we were ordered to deliver. If we don't deliver them, we won't get paid." "But what about the quarantine?" "We won't send a vessel down until we can raise someone," he said. "We'll be careful." And so they established a high orbit, hanging in the sky, still trying to raise someone, without success. "Shall I continue, sir?" asked the communications officer. The captain hesitated, finally nodded, and so the officer went through each channel again, still without success. Maybe there was a prison break, thought Jency. Maybe they've taken over. And then, there on the screen in front of them, but growing larger, a tiny disruption in the space in front of them. "What's that?" asked one of the crew. Nobody answered. They were slowly gaining on it, the disruption gaining in size to become an object. Slowly it resolved into a ship. "A sovereign colony gunship," said the navigator finally. "What is it doing here?" asked the communications officer. "It's laying down orbital mines," said the navigator. "They're sealing off the planet." "Hail them," said the captain. "There must be some kind of mistake." At first they didn't answer, but when the navigator repeated the ship's number and used the emergency frequency, someone finally answered. "Groder here," the man said. He wore the insignia of a commander, his face hard and craggy. "Commander Groder," began the captain, "we have 3 months of supplies aboard. We cordially request—" He trailed off. On the screen, the commander had lifted one hand to stop him and was shaking his head. "I'm sorry," Commander Groder said. "You happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." The captain stood there looking confused. On the screen, they could see some smaller objects gravitating toward them. At first, it was difficult to tell what they were exactly. "Oh shit," thought Jency. "The mines." He turned and began to run. Behind him, the bridge had gone into action. The captain barked orders as the navigator began to swing the ship around, but Jency knew it was going to be too late. He kept running as fast as he could, yelling as he went, raising the alarm. He passed over the elevator and slid down the ladder to the lower decks. Halfway down, the first mine struck and he lost his grip, falling, clanging down the shaft. Above, there was a sucking sound as the atmosphere began to rush out, and when he was nearly dragged back up the ladder until the bulkhead shield rose and cut off the leak, he stood up and stumbled down the corridor, found a locker holding an astrosuit rig with oxygen storage, and struggled into it. The helmet began to assemble itself automatically around his head. From above came the sounds of screaming. A few more people had had the same idea he had and were making for the escape pods as well, rushing toward him. Another explosion came, this time on the lower decks, and Jency and the people running toward him were sucked backward. He watched them spill out through a jagged hole into space and nearly went out that way himself, but managed to catch hold of one raggedly imploded edge and held on while the pressure equalized. He pulled himself back into the ship. The artificial gravity had disabled now, so he had to use his zero-grav boots to find his footing. The sound, too, had gone strange, rushing out with the atmosphere. Everything now sounded dampened, almost non-existent. The noise of his boots clomping toward the escape pods was more vibration that could be barely felt rather than an actual sound. Almost the only thing he could hear was his own panicked breathing. He hurried forward down the corridor, floating now with chunks of debris, only to see open space where the first set of pods should have been. Though the next pod seemed intact. Behind him he heard a muffled noise and then was nearly knocked off his feet. Behind him he heard a muffled noise and then was nearly knocked off his feet by the shockwave that came with it. "I'm going to die," he thought, and then disengaged his boots and pushed off. But without gravity, it was hard to do right. He immediately knew, directing himself too high, was likely to spin out the open hole and into space. He tried to stretch and curl to change his trajectory, but little seemed to happen, and he was going out and drifting away. But then there it was, a piece of debris floating above him, and he pushed it as hard as he could. It stopped his momentum and sent him sideways at a slower pace, and he got close enough to the outer hull that he could turn on the anti-gravity boots and let them slowly suck him to it. He quickly clomped his way along the hull and worked his way around to the underside, running along the roof and down the wall to the remaining pods. One had its door open, and he saw, lying slumped in its entrance, Swanson. His eyes were bugged out, and he was dead from lack of oxygen. Another man dead, he thought. He dragged the man up and out of the way and climbed in. The door levered slowly shut behind him. He webbed in and braced himself, and then pressed the release, and then he webbed in and braced himself, and then pressed the release and the ignition. The craft darted out, already spinning, twirling down through the atmosphere. He hoped it was small enough not to draw the mines, or that they would disintegrate, or that they would disintegrate in the atmosphere before they hit. Twisting quickly planetward, he held on for dear life. "35. What the hell was that?" asked Dr. Dexter. Her eyes were wide and she looked terrified. "So you finally feel it?" Bryden asked. His head throbbed and he could barely stand. It has to yell to you before you'll hear it. I've been hearing it all along." "It's not a person, Bryden," she said. "It's dangerous. Maybe there's something wrong with it. We need to shutter the project before it kills us." "Shutter it? Are you mad? We're just starting to get somewhere." "What were we getting? Where were we getting is that?" said Callie, gesturing to Isfin, who was lying on the ground beside the marker, shivering. His eyes rolled back into his head. "It's knocked him senseless." "No, he'll be okay," said Bryden. He approached him, checked his pulse. "Just some kind of fit," he said, standing back up. "He'll snap out of it." "Bryden, the marker is not a good thing. It means us harm," said Callie. "Don't be ridiculous," he said. "This is the key to our salvation." Callie shook her head, laughing bitterly. "You're so obsessed. You can't see what's right in front of you," she said. "You want this to be a religious experience. It doesn't matter to you what evidence there is to the contrary or what it actually is. Evidence be damned, you've already decided what it is." Bryden just shook his own head and turned away. He knelt beside Isfin and began to slap his face lightly, watching his eyes. After a moment, Isfin's eyelids fluttered, and his pupils fell back into place, and his jaw unclenched. "There," said Bryden. "There." He turned and looked up at Callie. "You see? He's just fine." "Fine he is. Fine is he. Bryden, we have to shutter the project. You need to let the commander know right away." Isfin was coming around, looking at Bryden. The latter reached out, stroked the side of Isfin's face. "What did you see?" he asked. "What did it tell you? What does it want from us?" Isfin didn't say anything. "Bryden, if you don't tell Groder, I will," said Dr. Dexter. When Bryden didn't answer, she gave a little stamp of frustration and headed toward the door. "Dr. Dexter," he finally said, just as she was reaching it. She stopped and turned, only to find him pointing a pistol at her, slowly walking toward her. "What are you doing?" she asked. "What I should have done a long time ago," he said. She raised her hand slowly. "You shouldn't do this, Bryden," she said. "You're not thinking straight." "Oh no, Dr. Dexter," he said. "I know what I'm doing. Now turn around and walk. Straight through the door and across the control room and out that door too. I'll tell you when to stop walking. I'm in charge now. Are you? Asked Callie coolly over her shoulder. Seems like the marker might be the one in charge. He marched her through the control room, the scientists inside stopping their work to stare in astonishment at the procession they made and out into the hall. They walked until they came to the security station. Like to remain I'd like to remain the prisoner, said Bryden to the man inside. Prisoner? Said the security officer, wrinkling his brow. Yes, man, said Bryden. Right here. But that's Dr. Dexter, said the officer. Of course it's Dr. Dexter, he said. She's a traitor. She needs to be confined to the brig. The officer stared back and forth from Callie to Bryden. If you don't do it, he'll probably just shoot me, she finally said. The officer shrugged. He took her by the arm and led her into the brig and closed the door. In the marker room, Istvin lay immobile on the floor, staring up at the two horns rising far above him. Dead Khan was there, poised upon the tips, and then his mother, and then the politician he shot, Fisher. Their faces shuffled over one another to become one face. The voice, too, seemed a blend of all their voices, a multitonal voice that seemed both high and low at once. The other world was the real world, he now knew. It was what really mattered. But the marker existed in both worlds. It was the thing that bridged the gap. Do you understand now? The three ghosts that were one above him asked. Yes, he tried to say. Yes, I understand. But the words did not come out, and yet the marker heard him say them nevertheless. There was movement around him, strange shadows flitting. It took a moment for him to begin to make things out. These were the scientists, he realized slowly. Maybe 4 of them, maybe 5, come to check on him. One pressed his fingers to Istvin's throat and said something. Another was lifting one eyelid even higher and peering in, as if to look inside his skull. He tried to ignore them, tried to think of them as something like buzzing flies, but they were still there, an irritation. We are not right, said the ghost. Or rather, we are right, but now we must become something else. We need you to make us whole and make us new. Make you whole, mumbled Istvin. Make you new. What? Said one of the scientists. Did he say something? Say something. See something, said Istvin. We will use you as a vessel, said the ghost. You will take our image, the image of not only what we are, but of what we might become, and you will share it. Share it, mumbled Istvin. Did he say sheriff? Asked one of the scientists. What would that even mean? We must be free, said the ghost. We must be free. Slowly the vision faded, or didn't fade so much as simply slip into the background. It was still there, the triple ghost still with its flickering faces, but the faces were changing much more slowly now, every couple of seconds rather than several times a second. And it was subdued and quiet enough that Istvin could see the scientists better and hear them too. Are you all right? One of them asked. Was he? What did the man even mean by that? He hesitantly nodded. One of them was holding a hand out to him, offering to help him up. He waved the hand away. Not ready yet? The man said. Sure, give yourself a moment. No point rushing things. I'm staying here, said Istvin. Of course, said the man. No reason to move you until you're ready. I'll never be ready, said Istvin. This is where I live. He needed to be here until the ghosts were free, until he had accomplished his task, his purpose. A strange twinge of confusion came to him with that word, purpose. But why? You can't stay here, the man reasoned. You can't just stay on the floor. He shook his head. Of course he could stay here. Why couldn't he? You're not thinking properly, said the man. You're still in shock or something. I think three of us can carry you out of here and put you someplace where you can rest. I can rest here, he said, and there is no time for rest. Come on, the scientist said, reaching out again with his hands. If he wants to stay here, said the voice, it took him a moment to recognize as belonging to Bryden, then he can stay here. He looked over at Bryden and smiled. Yes, Bryden understood. Some of it, anyway. And then Bryden was there kneeling beside him, eyes shining. It wants you to stay here? He asked. It? What did he mean by it? Couldn't he see the ghosts? Isfin gestured at them, but Bryden only saw the marker. Yes, he said, placing a hand on his shoulder. I understand. Sorry, wrong voice. Yes, he said, placing a hand on his shoulder. I understand. No, thought Isfin. He doesn't exactly understand. But it didn't matter. It was close enough. Bryden would let him do what he wanted, what needed to be done. He would live here, at the base of the marker, and he would learn from it until it had taught him all that he could know. And he would teach it the little he knew, and then he would go out into the world. And he would go out in the world and preach for it until everyone understood and more markers began to arise, and there was the dawning of a brighter day. 36. The brighter day began with a murder, followed shortly by a suicide. In the penal colony, a man by the name of James Colbert, who had become more and more moody, who was keeping more and more to himself, wrapped his arms around the neck of another inmate by the name of Ken Dollar and choked him first unconscious and then dead. The other inmates, once they realized what was happening, tried to drag Colbert away, but it was too late. And while they were seeing if there was anything to be done to save Dollar, Colbert wandered, mumbling, along the edge of the crowd. He was being closely watched by several of the other inmates, but not closely enough that he couldn't, when they were distracted by the attempts to revive Dollar, suddenly take off at a run for the wall and try to run through it so hard that he cracked his own skull and damaged his brain. He was soon dead as well. Henry watched the murder, horrified. He called the guards in the middle of it. By the time they were assembled near the door, Colbert had killed himself as well. Henry signaled the alarm to send the convicts back to their cells. He was surprised when this time all but one or two of the men kept milling about, making no effort to return to their cell. He waited and then started the loudspeaker message, giving them 30 seconds warning, but they ignored this too. What now? He wondered. Ever since Bryden and his men had come, the prisoners had been on edge, and it hadn't subsided when they left, taking Jency's brother with them. No, it had just gotten worse. With the guards and technicians as well, he thought. Fights had broken out. One of the guards, a normally stolid, experienced fellow named Marshall, had almost bitten another man's ear off. He'd been thrown into a room and locked in, where he proceeded to shout and scream, throwing himself against the walls. When they finally opened the door to let him out the next day, they found him sitting in his own filth. He had slashed open his palm and had smeared the walls with blood. Excuse me. But it was not just smears, Henry realized on closer examination. He had been drawing symbols, creepy, odd-looking things that didn't look like any language that Henry had ever seen. He'd called Commander Grotto and told him. The commander grunted, then told him to take a vid of the walls and send them along immediately. What am I to do with Marshall? He asked. Marshall? Throw him in a cell. Put him out there with the other prisoners. He had, but had kept him locked in his cell just in case. One of the other prisoners, a man named Waldron, would bring Marshall food and slide it through the slot at the bottom of the bars sometimes. Bottom of the bars. Sometimes Marshall'd eat it and sometimes not. He kept worrying the wound on his hand, splitting it open, and when he could, get it to bleed again. He'd paint more of the symbols on the floor, on the back wall, on the sheets, even on his own body. What had done that to him? Wondered Henry at the time. And then, looking at the screen, at the two dead bodies and the men milling about, what has done that to them? The guards were still standing near the door, awaiting instructions. Their leader opened a link, asked Henry what the problem was. The prisoners won't return to their cells, he said. What? Said the man. How many of them? 1, 2? More, said Henry. Almost all of them. That's all right, said the man, his nostrils flaring. We can take them. He seemed to relish the idea, which made Henry realize that if he opened the door, someone, maybe a lot of people, were likely to end up dead. Go back to your quarters, he said. I'm not going to open the door. Come on, Wendray, he said. Open it. No, said Henry. Go back to your quarters. That's an order. With some grumbling, the angry man drifted away, and Henry turned back to watch the screen. What am I to do with the bodies? He wondered. Henry watched the prisoners still milling about, still wandering, sometimes nearly stumbling over one of the corpses. He watched two of them grab one of the bodies and drag them over to the hole that Bryden had dug. They released it, and in it went, tumbling down the hole. Then they went back for the second one. Good enough, Henry thought, and turned his attention elsewhere. Isfin stayed there beside it, caressing it, staring up at it. It was listening to him, responding to him. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful, gorgeous thing, and what it was doing to his mind was gorgeous too. It was changing him, making him more like it, and he was changing it too. It was learning how to talk to him, and then was sending its voice all around, looking for brains like his. But his brain was special. What his brain understood, the other brains felt as pain. He watched the others, watched how they reacted, the confusion on their faces, the way their eyes lit up, but without a real glow. Their brains started to break when the marker touched them. For the signal was meant for brains closer to his, not for brains like theirs. And the signal was growing, getting stronger. The scientists who came often to stare at the marker and stare at him, too, could feel it mostly as pain, though one or two had a little more flexible cerebral matter and seemed to begin to see hints of traces of the ghosts that Isfin saw now all the time. The scientists whispered back and forth, too, spoke of what was going on outside the marker chamber, bringing him news. More and more people were going mad, they said, though what they meant by mad exactly he wasn't sure. There were fights for no reasons, strange acts of self-harm and suicide. Order was beginning to fall apart. The social structure of the compound was beginning to collapse. But that was okay, thought Isfin. You always had to tear things down before you could build them back up again. There were scientists who always came to see him, Bryden among them, a group of the committed, the faithful. They clustered around him, waiting for him to move or speak. One of them recorded his gestures, his words. Only they weren't his words exactly. He only said what the ghosts were already saying, if only the scientists could see them and hear them. Why can't they? He wondered. He didn't know the answer. Other scientists, though, never came in. He saw them in the control room, keeping to their monitors and systems and standing near the glass. There were two camps, he dimly began to realize. Bryden was in charge of one, the group that believed the marker and its possibilities. Of this group, some of them were unitologists committed to the project for religion. These, Bryden chief among them, were zealous. Isvan sensed in them a willingness to go to almost any extreme for their cause. Others were simply scientists and either atheists or unconcerned about religion, but these still saw him in a kind of unique catalyst. But these, sorry, Others were simply scientists and either atheists or unconcerned about religion. But these still saw in him a kind of unique catalyst, an essential component for activating the marker. He was for all these something special, something to be treasured. The second group was the enemy, according to Bryden. Even though Kelly Dexter was imprisoned, she seemed to lead that group, shuttling messages back and forth to them. These scientists were the ones who largely stayed in the control room. They wanted to shutter the marker project. For them, something was desperately amiss, and they claimed the object to the and they claimed to the to and they claimed to object to the idea of bringing in a convict with a clear mental derangement as a key part of the project. But with Dr. Dexter imprisoned, they seem to have lost a certain amount of their will and were somewhat ineffectual. Kelly had managed to smuggle a fair amount of equipment into the cell. The guard, confused that she was there at all, seemed happy to accept her notes and carry them to one of her contacts in the control room. He would come back with notes from them that explained what had happened and what was currently going on, and she would write responses, sending them off with the shambling guard again. And the more than that, one of the infiltrators in the marker chamber managed to get close enough to Isvin to scan his brainwaves for several hours and then sent her a memory stud with the data. Entering that, she charted Isvin's derangement, trying to understand how damaged he was. His brainwaves were highly abnormal, the sequence irregular, and the waveform variable. No question about it, he was an extremely damaged individual. Worse, she realized, comparing these with the marker pulses, the marker seemed more responsive to his brainwaves and perhaps was even adapting to them. Having Isvin near the marker was not good for it. It was sharpening the signal, making it more intense. It was perhaps no coincidence that dementia had increased. The signal had risen. Was it because of Isvin? Hard to say. The researcher in her reminded her that the dementia had always been there, and it might have developed this way on its own in any case. Though things had definitely gotten worse around the time Isvin arrived. Through the slot in the door, she asked the guard to go fetch Bryden. He sidled slowly off. She waited, looking over the data again. Yes, she was right. She was sure of it. The marker effects were getting worse. A few minutes later, the guard was back. Can't come, he said. Can't or won't? Asked Callie. The guard shrugged. Do you think you could let me out? She asked. The guard shook his head, but slowly, as if he might be able to be convinced. What if I told you it was a matter of life and death? She asked. Whose life? The guard asked. Whose death? Everybody's, said Callie. The guard's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? He asked. If Istvin isn't removed, the consequences will be dire, said Callie. Go tell Bryden that, and tell him it was for me. For a moment, the guard looked confused, and then he shuffled off again. This time, he came back with Bryden. The latter looked irritated. His hair was a mess and his jumpsuit smelled. He looked like he hadn't bathed in days. What is it now? He asked through the slot. She tried to explain, but halfway through he cut her off. Isvin's fine, he said. We need him. The marker speaks to him. But he's changing the signal, said Kelly. The marker is becoming more enabled, but in the wrong way. The signal was weak before, but Now it's tuned and affecting nearly everybody, and symptoms of dementia which were subdued before seem to have become more acute, even torturous. It was always sending out something that encouraged dementia, but it's suddenly become much, much worse. That's ridiculous, said Bryden. The marker is glorious, and Isfin is its prophet. Callie shook his head. She bent down, brought up an audio log, played it for him. It was Isfin's voice, rambling slowly on. We must be made whole again. You must take us and carry us and make us again. And when we are in that place and you made, from there you must carry us and make us again. She clicked it off. So, said Bryden. Can't you hear what he's saying, Bryden? Callie asked. The marker is teaching him how to reproduce it. And what's more, my data suggests the marker is rewiring his warped brain. Look at how many dead we already have. How many suicides? Collateral damage, Bryden said. Collateral damage? Really? Besides, I don't think there have been that many more suicides or dead than usual in circumstances such as these. Are you serious? Said Callie. Bryden, you're willfully turning a blind eye. It's you who are blind, said Bryden. No, said Dexter said. Bryden, you have to believe me. The marker is dangerous. And with Isfin near it, it's probably even more dangerous. Blasphemy, said Bryden. It's not anything of the kind. Besides, if you won't stop it, I will. Bryden smiled. Do your worst, he said. You're imprisoned in a cell. And then he turned on his heel and left. Through it all, Isfin stayed there beside the marker. This, the ghost of the murdered Fitcher told him, was where he would be safe. If he were to stay here, beside the marker, then it would protect him. From what? He asked. The marker did not seem to have a ready answer for this question. All around him, through the haze that was the real world, swarmed the other world, swirling and dynamic, full of ghost and beauty. Now, when the veil fell, it fell quickly and all at once. He could see in the marker the shape and image of himself. He belonged here, with it, with the marker. Though he looked human in flesh and blood, he felt he was more akin to this twisting tower of stone than to these people gathered around him, staring at him. They were built wrong. He could tell just by looking at them. The marker wasn't talking to them. It was talking to him. It will keep me safe, he told himself. And saying that somehow made him think of Jency, whom he hadn't thought of for a long time. Jency had protected him, had kept him safe, or had for a while anyway, until suddenly he couldn't or wouldn't do it anymore. When he thought about that part of it, it made him angry. He had needed Jency's help, but where had his brother been? Jency had even been there when the joke with Councilman Fisher had gone wrong. He had seen him in the crowd. But had Jency saved him? Had he prevented them from dragging him away and here? No, he hadn't. He had failed him. But the marker would not fail him. It had said it would protect him, and so it would. The marker had power, and it was giving its power to him. He was, in some senses, becoming it. We need to reproduce, the dead were saying. The marker was saying through the dead. There need to be more of us. We cannot live on this planet all our lives. No, thought Isfin, you can't. You must call out louder and hope for them to hear us and take us into themselves, as you have done, Isfin. Yes, thought Isfin, as I have done. He could feel the form and shape of the marker imprinted in his head, a delicate and beautiful structure, as entrancing as his numbers had been. It was the marker, and he felt an almost overwhelming urge to try to bring it out of his head and try to reproduce it in life. Soon others, he knew, would be feeling the same urge. The dead were there now, in numbers, swirling all around him. All of their mouths were opening and they were singing, "It's time." They were singing, "It's time." Yes, he thought. It was time. He stood and the scientists around him looked rapt upon him. Bryden was beside him, reaching one hand out and touching Istvin's shoulder. Then Istvin felt it coming. He lifted his hands high above his head. When he brought them down, the pulse came with it. "37. In the penal colony, the prisoners reeled and collapsed. Henry, too, found himself clutching his head, waiting for whatever was happening to pass. And then he lifted his head again. It was to see most of the prisoners confused and wandering, much in the same state as he. But then a few of them became more focused. One man grabbed another and tugged him over to the hole Bryden had dug, and then both stared down into it. Henry turned on the audio feed, trying to hear what they were saying, but by now they weren't saying anything. They were just staring into the hole. The corruption had spread, Henry realized, growing quickly and rapidly with the last burst, and had squirmed its way down the hole. Perhaps that was what they were looking at. He did hear other sounds, though. A few of the other men groaning, a few scraps of speech, and then also something else. Something that he didn't know quite how to interpret. A strange sound like the breaking and snapping of sticks. Wood? He thought. There was no wood out there. Maybe no wood anywhere in the compound, but it definitely sounded like that. What could it be? He turned up the volume a little, but no longer heard the snapping sounds. Instead, there was a sort of damp, squelchy noise. And then one of the men closest to the hole flinched and stepped back. He opened his mouth and began to scream. It was a strong one, and different than what Kelly had felt before. When she came to, it was to find that she had unconsciously been beating her head against the cell wall. Her forehead was sore and bloody. I could have really hurt myself, she thought. She stumbled back to the machine and observed how it had graphed the pulse. Saw how it had shot off the range of the chart. Her cell, too, suddenly had a lot of those tendrils winding through it. They hadn't been there before. Something new is happening, she thought. She stood and peered out the slot to see if she could see anything, but the hallway seemed empty. There, too, were more patches of corruption and tendrils, one of them big and long enough to almost seem like a cable. She called for the guards, but he didn't come. She called for the guard, but he didn't come. She called again, louder, this time beating her hand on the metal door, and this time he came, walking slowly and ponderously, with a strange, dragging sound. She heard him long before she saw him, and when she saw him, he was clutching his head, a strange, frenzied look disrupting his features in such a way that it seemed like his face was made of parts of the faces of 4 very different men. He stared through the slot, one eye clenched tightly shut, the other eye darting nervously about in its orbit. "Are you all right?" she asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he brought his face down hard against the door, splitting his forehead on the lip of the slot. Startled, Dr. Dexter stepped back. He raised his head, and she saw, through the narrow opening of the slot, blood cascading down his forehead. He took a strange, swooping step and struck his head again, even harder this time. Then she was splattered, and she was spattered with his blood oozing down the inside of the slot as well. And then he fell out of sight. She heard a scraping sound that she couldn't place, then the sound of him pulling his way back up the door. Suddenly, Callie was concerned he might try to unlock it and come in after her. She, she backed deeper into the cell, her hands feeling for the wall behind her. The guard's face appeared, the flesh over his eye torn away to reveal a stretch of pinkish bone. He swayed and then tilted his head back. "No!" shouted Callie, but it was already too late. He brought his head down hard and fast, and this time she could see the lip of the slot break through his head with a crunch, and he fell away he left, along with the blood, shards of his brain and bone. He fell as heavy as a sack, and then did not move again. Callie still stayed pressed back against the wall, holding her breath, waiting for him to move again, wondering fleetingly what had been wrong with the man, what had driven him to do what he had. What had driven him to do what he had. Then her glance fell to the now blood-spattered monitor, the graph with the lines stretching off it and lost beyond the edge of the screen. And then she thought she knew. In the interrogation room, they had left the body covered by a sheet, and then had forgotten about it. It had started to smell, and the body had grown sodden and had begun to change, parts of it clinging to the sheet and soaking it through with a grayish ichor. Here there were no flies or insects, and little bacteria beyond that in the body itself, so the decay was strange and unusual. The one guard who had looked into the room, searching for somewhere to take a quick nap while he was on duty, had quickly gone back out again. Underneath the sheet, something was happening. A tendril of corruption had curled up the leg of the table and felt its way to the head. There was a snapping sound and the body seemed to sit up, the sheet still clinging to it. A leg snapped and slid out at a strange angle, and then the body contorted and fell off the table. It lay there half wrapped in the sheet, still changing. The head twisted and opened up. The jaw dropped downward and pushed deep into the body. The legs broke, and the skin of the chest stretched and fused between them in a kind of sheet. Soon what had once looked human looked more like a flesh-colored bat. And then the creature, groaning, no longer human, began to crawl. A moment later, it tested its wings. The screaming brought some of the other prisoners over to the hole. Henry watched them peer in, his hand near the button to call the guards. One of the men had his friends hold his arms, and then he leaned over the hole and looked down from a different vantage. And then suddenly something strange happened. An odd bat-like creature flapped out of the hole and wrapped itself around the man's head. The men holding him let go in surprise, and he fell into the hole, and everyone who had been close began running back and away, scattering all through the circle and moving towards the cell. Some were even, he could see on another of the screens, up against the large door leading out to the ring in which Henry and the guards were screaming, pounding against the door, begging to get out. Sorry, I need to read that again. Some were even, he could see on another of the screens, up against the large door leading out to the ring in which Henry and the guards were, screaming, pounding against the door, begging to get out. What the hell is going on? Wondered Henry. He summoned the guards and kept watching, zooming in close on the hole. What had it been? How had it gotten in? He kept the camera focused on the hole. When the guards arrived at their stations, he sounded the alarm for the prisoners to return to their cells. He let his eyes flick around to the other monitors. Some were already there. The others, though, made no move to do so. The number of prisoners pounding on the door leading out had increased. They weren't moving. His earpiece crackled. "All assembled, sir." The leader of the guards stood. "Open the door." "Just a moment," said Henry. His attention back on the hole, he stared at it perhaps 30 seconds, perhaps slightly longer. "This isn't going to be another of those false alarms, is it?" the leader of the guards asked. "No," said Henry, half distracted. "I just have to figure out a way to get them away from the door." "How many of them are there?" asked the leader. "We can take control of the situation, I bet." "Kill them, you mean?" asked Henry. "We don't have to kill them. We don't have to kill all of them," said the guard. "We can stun some of them." Henry opened his mouth to reply and then stopped. Something was happening on the monitor. Something was stirring in the hole. Okay, despite my voice, I'm going to try to read to the end of what I had planned. So, 38. This time, when it came, it took Ensign Haley's breath away. She hesitated, swaying for a moment, and then slipped from her chair and passed out. She was standing with a woman dressed all in white, who it took her a moment to recognize as her mother. She was younger than she remembered, and not ill, but there was no doubt about it. She was her mother. She had the same way of tilting her head when she asked a question, and the way she moved and rubbed her hands too was just like how her mother had done it. No, it was her mother. There was no reason to doubt it, except that she was younger and not ill. But surely there was a way to explain that. She was thinking of ways to explain it, thinking of explanations when her mother asked, "Would you like to see my garden?" "I'd be delighted," she said. And she was. She imagined her mother walking her through rows of vegetables, or walking her through flower beds humming with bees. They would walk and talk just as they had before her mother had gotten sick. But no, wait. Her mother wasn't sick now. She must have recovered. That was the explanation. That must be it. But there were no flowers. There were no vegetables. Instead, her mother took her around the corner and she saw there, sprouting up from the earth, a two-pronged thing that looked like long horns twisting around one another. It was gigantic, filling the whole plot of the garden and stretching high into the sky. That wasn't a garden, was it? But her mother was guiding her to the thing and touching it, talking to her about how she grew it, how she cared for it. And then she simply stepped inside the thing and brought her daughter along with her. There she was, touching everything, pointing to each cell and bit of it, feeling her way around and through it. "Because you see," said her mother, "the reason I'm telling you this is so that you can be an even better gardener than me." "Better than you?" she said. Her mother nodded. "When you grow it, when you have your turn, it will be even better." When she woke up, she was not on the floor but at her desk, having scrawled into her pad pages and pages of notes. They had all gone, she knew, to Groder. But what would he do with them? She tried to go back and look at old scrawls from earlier to try to understand what was happening to her, what lessons she was supposed to learn. But they were no longer on the machine. They had been removed. Had she removed them? She didn't remember. Maybe she had, but why would she? Groder, then. Yes, maybe. But she trusted Groder. Was she right to? Perhaps Groder had taken the information from her, removed it and made it his own, and had thought he'd taken it away from her as well. But she had it all inside, had it all in her head. She could feel it. It was part of her now. Maybe she would go back to her room and write it down again, write it for herself this time, so that when the time came, she could decide what to do with it. She would write it down and send it to friends, people she could trust. No, Groder would not be allowed to keep the information to himself. Anybody who wanted to be a gardener was welcome to it. I'll be there in a few days, the gray man insisted. There's no use arguing about it. We need her. But she's good at her job, said Groder. She's ambitious and smart, and now that she's given you what you wanted, she deserves to be left alone. The gray man shook his head. There's always more that we want, he said, and I think she has more to give. I think there's more hidden inside of her than meets the eye. I need to crack her head open in person, get at it. If I'm right, she now carries the key to the next stage of the project. But you can't. I can and will, said the gray man. "39. She was going over the figures, looking at the other machines, trying to make sense of all the data and how it related when she heard something. A kind of flapping. At first she ignored it. Then something struck her door, and she thought of the guard who had beaten his own head apart. Maybe he was not dead yet after all. Maybe he was trying to get up. She stood slowly and made her way to the slot. Even though it was not cut in such a way to allow her to see the bottom of the door. But something was happening there. She could hear something, a crackling sound, like the sound that logs make when they pop and crack in the fire. Not that she had ever seen them. Wood was too valuable to waste on the fire. But she had watched the vids when she was a kid. But that didn't make sense. Who would start a fire here? And if there was one, she'd smell it and see the smoke. And if not that, what could it be? She knelt down and pressed her ear to the door. She could still hear sounds, but not much more clearly. It didn't help any. She stood up again, tried again to look out, still saw nothing. The noises continued for a while, and then stopped. She still waited, wondering what to do. And then a different noise started, the sound of movement, something sliding up the door. Yes, he must be the guard, she thought. He must still be alive after all. He must be standing up now. She backed up a little just to be careful. Would he be violent like he'd been before? Had the signal faded enough that he might have escaped whatever was troubling him? His head rose to where she could see it in the slot, and she caught her breath. His face was streaked with blood, but something else had changed about it too. The jaw was loose in a way it shouldn't have been. It was hanging wrong. The head was oddly lumpy, perhaps where the skull had been broken, and the eyes had slipped farther in than they had been before. "Are you all right?" she asked. He didn't say anything, just stood where he was, staring at her through the slot. "You should get immediate medical attention," she said. "You're very hurt, perhaps in shock too." She moved a little closer, and suddenly he thrust his arm through the slot and tried to grab her with it. Only it wasn't his arm exactly, she realized, but a long scythe. Where had he gotten a scythe? But then she realized that it was made of bone. It was not a scythe at all, but a part of him. It scrabbled at the door, trying to get out. It was dragging the sheet behind it, parts of the sheet still adhering to it. It kept scratching, butting against the door. Down the hall were the guards, still gathered outside the door to the next ring, the inner ring, milling about, getting more and more irritated and anxious as their leader spoke to Wandre over vid. One of them, a young blond man named Miller, was more nervous than before. For days now, he'd been itching for a fight, something to sink his teeth into, and now was his chance to have one. But Wandre was refusing to open the door. Calm down, said Ramirez, the guard standing nearest to him. I can't calm down, said Miller. I have to get out there. You can't be out there yet, said Ramirez. We can't go until we've been given approval. It may not even come at all. Like last time, said Miller. Like last time, Ramirez agreed. Miller continued quivering, shaking, stretching, nearly bouncing off the walls. You're driving me crazy, Ramirez finally said. You're getting everybody wound up. Look, if you need to get some energy off, then take a walk. I won't leave without you. Miller was off like a shot, rushing down the hall. It felt good to move a little. Maybe it'd help. He moved as quickly as he could, following the slow curve of the hall. It didn't help much, but it helped a little. He went to the end of the hall and the locked door there, and stopped. He was just turning around and starting back again when he heard a strange scrabbling sound inside the door. Anyone there? He asked. The scrabbling grew louder. A kind of hissing and strangling noise joined it. He unhooked his truncheon from his belt, hefted it in his hand. Someone or something was in there, and he was going to find out what it was. He reached for the door and then stopped. Whatever it was it dangerous? Should he be doing this on his own? But no, he told himself. He was wearing full red gear. What could possibly happen to him? At first glance, it seemed to Henry like he was watching a man's back, the spine clear and pronounced, but there was no head. No, it couldn't be a man, he told himself. He was experiencing some odd sort of perspectival shift, was seeing things wrong. And there were no arms either, but rather strange flaps of skin, wings almost. And then he saw that yes, they were wings, and the creature took off. He followed it from monitor to monitor as it flew short distances and alighted, searching for something. What was it searching for? And then another one came out of the hole too, half fluttering its way to the top, and then alighting there on the rim of the hole, waiting for a moment. It was still enough that Henry could see it clearly, and see now something that at first he couldn't believe. He understood now why he had first thought it was a human's back. It was because whatever the creature was now, it had once been human. It was formed out of one of the corpses in the hole. How was that possible? Henry wondered. He shook his head. He must be hallucinating, he thought. But no, when he opened his eyes, the creature was still there. And then there was further movement in the hole, and he saw a strange sword-like object slide out and anchor itself against the floor. More like a scimitar. Scimitar, really, though not that exactly either, and attached to something that was strangely banded, but still evidently flesh. A face and body followed. He could recognize it as the face and body of the man who had leaned over the hole and fallen in. Could even see bits and scraps of his prison clothing. He knew it was him, but still couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe how the man had bent and changed, had been taken apart and then put back together in an incomprehensible way. It was a face and body unlike anything he had ever seen. "40. The creature that had once been a guard roared, clawing at her through the slot in the door. It either did not remember it had the key to the door, or, in this state, did not know how to work it. In any case, it did not open the door. At first, she crouched against the back wall, afraid, eyes squinched shut. But slowly, her scientific curiosity got the better of her, and she began watching it, even coming a little closer. Whatever the thing was now, it had once been human. But whatever the thing was now, whatever the thing had, sorry, lost my place. Whatever the thing was now, it had once been human. But she could see, but she could see little human responses left in it, little to suggest it still had a connection to its human side. Even its movement seemed almost programmed, a repetition of certain patterns along a search for living bodies. She could move to one side of the cell or the other, and it would turn to follow her, like a flower following the sun. After a while, she was convinced that it wasn't human any longer. Not only that, she wasn't certain that it was a thinking creature at all. It was more like something constrained to draw from a limited set of responses. Was it really alive? It was moving, yes, but it didn't seem to be breathing. If it was alive, it was not alive in a way that it had been before, back when it had been human. But the more important question was first how to get out of the cell, and second, how to get past it. She had lots of electronic equipment here. Maybe she can construct something to broadcast out with, make some kind of distress signal. She was just starting to sort through her equipment to see what she had when from down the hall she heard a shout and the creature turned. Several shots rang out, and she even saw one of the bullets tear through the creature's chest before it started down the hall. The bullet didn't seem to affect it much at all. It didn't seem to experience any pain. Interesting, she thought, as it lumbered down the hall and out of her vision. Moments later, she heard a series of additional shots, and then a series of screams, the latter cut suddenly short. Miller hit it hard with the truncheon, gave it a blow that should have paralyzed it, but the creature hardly seemed to notice. Abruptly, it had leapt and was upon him, its bat-like wings wrapping him in an obscene embrace. And then the creature leaned in, but its proboscis knocked against the front of his faceplate. Ha, Miller thought. I'm safe if it can't hurt me. And he tried to work his arm free so that he could hit the creature again. It knocked up against the faceplate again and hissed, and the proboscis darted forward hard and cracked the plastic. Oh shit, he thought. Another blow and the creature was almost through. He tried to shake it off, tried to break free, but it wouldn't let go of him. He screamed. It struck again, and this time it went not only through the faceplate, but deep into his brain. Henry watched as one of the bat-like creatures apparently found what it was looking for and swooped rapidly forward, wrapping itself around the convict's head and shoulders. The man, screaming, tried to push it away, but the creature held tight and then pulled him tighter. And then the proboscis, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, proboscis? Sorry, I'm actually going to take my time. One, to give my voice some relief, but I do actually want to know how to say this word because I feel like I'm really screwing it up. So there's a Probos. Here we go. Proboscis. Or proboscis. Proboscis. Okay, that's how I'm supposed to be pronouncing that. The man, screaming, tried to push it away, but the creature held tight and then pulled him tighter, and the proboscis shot out of its body and through the center of the man's forehead. The man collapsed, dead. The creature was still on him. The proboscis obscenely pumping something into the man's head. Then the bat-like creature pulled free and waddled off, awkward now on the floor. But as bad as that was, what followed was much worse. The body itself, already shivering by the time the creature left it, started to transform. Bones and muscles twisted and broke and inverted. Bones pushed out through flesh and changed, thinning, becoming something else. The whole body became something else, something other, became just like the creature with the scimitar-like arms that he had just seen crawl its way up out of the hole. Oh my God, thought Henry, and realized that before long, all the men in the room would become those things. Panicked, he opened the security door and then watched on the monitor the men trying to push their way in while the guards rushed out, striking all around them with their truncheons. No, he said on his headset to the guard leader. Don't hit them. Get them in here. Save them. What? Asked the leader. Drag them in and get your men back in as well. But keep those creatures out. What creatures? Asked the leader. And then he saw one of the shambling beings with blade-like arms. He ran toward it, truncheon lifted over his head, and a few moments later his head had been severed from his shoulder. Henry turned on the loudspeaker. Fall back, he yelled. Some of the guards did, but few didn't, and many of the prisoners too were still out there. But he saw the bat-like creature and humanoid ones coming closer, and he felt he had no choice but to close the door. It slid slowly shut. A body was in the way, so he had to use the override to get it closed. When it did close, it slowly tore the body in half. The men were still outside, many of them, and one of them lost his arm in the door. He quickly tried to count the creatures, eyes flicking from screen to screen, and was pretty sure that they were all there outside. They were safe. Or so he thought until he heard the sound of screaming from down near the door. As the alarms went off, Isman remained calm. He watched people come and go, rushing in and out, and after a while everybody was gone, except for him and Bryden. Not all of them will come back, said Isman. Very few will. What? Said Bryden. It will keep us safe, said Isman, gesturing to the marker. Safe from what? Asked Bryden. But Isman did not answer. He closed his eyes and bowed his head and waited. "41. Henry closed the doors to the control room and locked them. It was the only way he could be sure of staying alive. He tried not to listen to the screams and yells, but he could not help but hear them. Even through the doors, he could see through the glass of the control room observation portal. The creature slowly tearing one of the guards apart. Then it moved on to another man, a convict this time. Where did it come from? How had it gotten in? Had he simply missed it? The guards tried to beat it with their truncheons, but it didn't seem to do much good. The creature just kept coming. One of the guards, managed to make it back to the armory and unlock a gun, but when he fired it at the creature, it had little effect. It just kept coming at him until it had him in its sights and was eating away the side of his face. 4 or 5 men were already down. Then another man, a prisoner, plucked up the gun, and this time, instead of firing into the creature's chest, he shot repeatedly at the creature's leg until it was little more than a tattered mass of tissue that gave out as soon as the creature put weight on it. And yet the creature kept coming, dragging itself forward now with the tips of its scythes until the man put enough bullets into the joints connected to the scythe to break it off. Even then the creature kept coming, crawling like a worm and trying to chew the man's leg off until one of the others had stamped on it enough times to separate the head from its shoulders. But the torso still moved, as if it were still alive. So perhaps the only way to stop it is to immobilize it, thought Henry. Cut off the limbs or render them inoperative in some way. Even then, it was still moving, but its ability to attack had been drastically diminished. The remaining guards and prisoners looked grim and seemed hostile to one another. Eventually, they took the bodies of the dead and put them in a line against one wall. So the creature was dead, thought Henry. Locking the doors of the control room to keep everybody else out had been premature. They had survived. He was just preparing to open the door when a wave of pain swept through his head. He grimaced, nearly fainted, and for a moment he could see, standing just beside him, as real as he had ever been when he was alive, his grandfather. "Papa?" he said. But it could not be his grandfather. His grandfather had been dead for years. The man, whoever he was, simply smiled and nodded, then reached out to pat his hand. Very slowly he began to fade, vanishing into nothingness. Henry shook his head to clear it. He was hearing sounds from below, but still confused, wasn't sure what exactly he was hearing. When he stood up and went to the window, he saw that another of the backlight creatures had appeared in the place of a corpse, and they had huddled over the corpse next to it, pumping something into its skull. By the time it moved on to the next corpse in line, the first corpse had already started to shudder and change. Soon the fighting started up again. It was terrible to watch, but Henry had a hard time looking away. At the end, nearly all of the creatures were dead, but all of the humans were dead too, and the room was scattered with corpses. Which was not good, thought Henry, because the next time a birth came, perhaps these corpses would start walking around, and now he was perhaps the only human left alive. He tried to place a call to the commander, but got no response. What was wrong? Maybe someone or something was jamming the circuit. He thought, or maybe they simply weren't answering. He placed a distress call on the general circuit and sent it out, hoping someone would hear it and would send help. But the signal didn't last long. After just a few minutes, it went dead. He tried to send it out again, but it was being jammed. He was working on it, trying to figure out how it was being jammed and who was behind it, when the vid link opened and showed him a picture of the commander's face. He had a stern expression on his face. "Do you need something?" he asked. "We're a little busy here." When Henry quickly filled him in on the situation, Commander Garter simply nodded. "Things have gone wrong at the other sites as well. All at once," he said, and Henry noticed for the first time that though his expression was stern, his eyes were tired and a little puzzled. "God only knows what we've unleashed," he said. "Sir, what other sites? Are we a site? What does it mean that we're a site?" He said. "Oh, you're at the penal colony, of course. You don't know anything about that." "What's going on, sir?" Henry asked. But the commander said, "I'm sorry, son, but we had to jam your signal. We can't have anyone stumbling onto this. We need to bring it to an end. It needs to end here." "But you've got to get us out of here," said Henry. "Or me, at least. I may be the only one left alive." The commander shook his head. "There are bigger things at stake here than your life. I'm afraid you're already as good as dead," he said, and then broke the link. One more chapter. 42. The pod was spinning as it came down, end over end. Jency tried to stabilize it, tried to straighten it out, but the controls weren't responding. He kept struggling with the stick, trying to bring it under control. He entered the atmosphere, and the ship's apron began to glow cherry red from the heat. The pod spun backward, and he saw the mine following him. And the next time he spun again, the mine was closer. He managed to finally get to the front end forward, and the craft directed and no longer tumbling, but he was still rolling around and around. And now he couldn't see where the mine was, how close it was, and it was likely to reach him. And when it was likely to reach him. Did he dare deploy the thrusters to try to slow the pod down? Or is the mine too close? Now in the atmosphere, the ship was beginning to handle differently. It was still rolling, but more slowly this time. He overcorrected for a moment and rolled in the other direction, but then slowly leveled. He was falling rapidly. Down below, he could see sets of lights, at a little distance from one another. One would be the secret facility, while the other would be the penal colony housing his brother. Which was which? Left or right? He stared, looking for a sign to tell him where to go. The lights on the left were clustered a little closer together, which perhaps he thought were indications of a more secure structure, something more compact. Maybe that could be the penal colony, though perhaps he was thinking about it all wrong. But what else was there to go on? So he pulled slightly left. Behind him came an explosion, and the craft shuddered. The mine had gone off, triggered by the heat of the atmosphere. The pod seemed undamaged, nothing showing up on the monitors, though the controls were a little sluggish now, so maybe some slight damage then. He turned on the forward thrusters to try to slow the craft, and they came on with a jolt that knocked his helmeted head against the instrument panel. The lights were getting closer, and he was slowing down, though not nearly as much as he wanted. He tried to increase the thrusters, but they were already going their maximum. The pod as a craft, he suddenly remembered, was not made for landing on a planet. It was just something to get you far enough away from a damaged or destroyed ship so that could pick you up another ship could pick you up in a few hours or few days. It had limited controls, limited steering, even limited power of movement. And indeed, he could see that some of the tiles on the apron had blackened and charred. If they were to come free, then the craft would get hotter and hotter until he cooked. You can do this, he told himself. He was a picker. He'd taken small crafts of all types and quality from the surface of the planet to an orbiting spaceship and back again. He had a lot of experience in this kind of thing. He fired the forward thrusters again, felt the jolt, and for a moment things were beginning to slow. What sort of impact could the pod survive? He had no idea. But how much fuel did he have for the thrusters? Already half gone, he saw on the monitor, so not much. There were separate indicators for the back thrusters, he realized, so they had a separate source. Poor design, he thought. If he had access to all the fuel at once, then he'd probably be able to spring the pod in, maybe even survive. Which gave him an idea. He aimed carefully for the complex, still knowing what he might do could very well bring him down miles away. He waited until he was close enough and then turned the thrusters on full and kept them on as long as possible until the low fuel indicator lit up. And then he turned on only one thruster and used it to spin the craft around. When he was flying backwards, he leveled out with the other thrusters, then cut them and turned the rear thrusters on full. He was flying backward, blind, hoping the rear thrusters would slow him down enough that he'd survive. He couldn't tell how far off course he might be, couldn't tell how far the ground was, couldn't tell how fast he was going either, though it did feel like he'd slowed some. He kept the rear thrusters on full, hoping he'd calculated well enough that he wouldn't run out of fuel, and sped up again before reaching the ground. He braced himself for impact. Henry just stared at the blank screen. At first, he tried to hail the commander again, but there had been no response. They weren't even bothering to answer his calls. Then he tried to send out a distress signal on another channel, only to find that blocked as well. Maybe if he had some skill in circuits and electronics, he could figure out something. Some sort of way of working around it. Really? What was the point? Even if he did manage to get a signal out there to reveal his dilemma and his position, the only ships in the area were the military ships attached to the commander, who had just told him he was as good as dead. Maybe the other complex had some sort of escape ship, but the prison complex didn't have one. It had been deemed a potential danger. The signal was his best bet, but even if he managed to get a signal past them and into some ship beyond, that still somehow the signal was his best bet, but even if he managed to get a signal past them into some ship beyond, but still somehow close enough to hear it, how long would it take them to come? 2 days at least, maybe 3. And then they'd have to make it past the commander's ship to get him, defeat the creatures that swarmed the prison and made the men in it like them. Sorry, my brain is. And then they'd have to make it past the commander's ship, get to him, defeat the creatures that had swarmed the prison and made the men in it like them, and get him out. He had water in the control room, but not very much, and no food at all. No, it wasn't going to happen. What do you do when you know you're going to die? Henry asked himself, and he found he had no answer. What he was doing now was staring at a blank screen, waiting for something to come to him. But nothing had. And also there was the question of how to die. He could simply starve to death, growing hungry, then slowly weaker, and very gradually fading out of existence. Or he could open the emergency cabinet and remove the pistol in it, and fire a shot through his skull. Or he could simply open the doors and let the creatures still milling about outside, somewhat idly now, make their way in and find him and kill him. There were probably other ways to go about it as well, quite creative ways if he could figure them out. Maybe that was what he would do. Spend his last few days figuring out more and more eccentric ways to die. At last he left the monitor, went and stood by the window. He could take the pistol and shoot out the window, he realized, and then the atmosphere would rush out and his lungs would collapse and he'd collapse too. It would take probably a few shots since the glass was impact resistant, but a few bullets fired just right would probably do it. He could see there, across the rocky plain, at some distance, the lights of the research facility. What were they doing over there? Were they the ones who had caused all this? And if he was being told that there was no getting out, were they being told the same thing? Were they doomed to die as well? There was, he knew, an ATV just outside the prison, something that the guards used to drive the supplies that landed at the penal colony over to the research facility. Maybe he could drive over there and join forces with them. Maybe together they could figure out what to do and find a way to survive. The menace was, for the moment, contained within the penal colony, at least as far as he could tell, so maybe there was still a safe space. He could drive there, no problem. The problem was figuring out how to get out and down to the ATV without being killed. He needed a rig with oxygen, a serious deep space number, but he wasn't even sure if they had one. At the very least, he needed a good rig and some O2 bottles, but those were in the locker down below with the creatures. He would never be able to get to them without being killed. And then looking out the window, he caught a flash of something above him, realized it was something falling from the sky. At first he thought it was on fire, but then realized that no, it was thrusters he was seeing. It was a ship coming down. He caught his breath, and for an instant thought maybe someone was coming to save him after all. But then he thought no. The ship was wrong for it to be a fully operational ship. It was something else. A rocket maybe, he thought. But then the thrusters would be on the other side, accelerating it instead of slowing it down. And then he realized that no, maybe it was an escape pod. Not someone coming to rescue him, but someone likely soon to be just as marooned as he. And then he realized it was heading straight at the penal colony, straight at him. It streaked fire as it fell from the sky, and then it struck. He felt it rattle hell all the way through. He clung to the wall to keep from falling, then rushed over to the monitors. Most were still operational, but a few were nothing but static now. Most of the ones in the central circle were down, so that must have been where the pod had hit. He scanned the other monitors for signs of whatever had struck, but saw nothing. What's there? He wondered, continuing to peer at the monitors, hoping something would soon appear. And who? All right. So that's it for today. Man, my voice was not off at a good start either, and feel like I wasn't reading as well as I could have in terms of previous reading sessions. But next Sunday will be the last of Dead Space Catalyst, the last of part 4. So either way, with that, I'm going to end things here. Get a nice proper drink of water. Until next time, guys, thank you for liking if you like. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys, see ya!